Чого ви прийшли? Щоб ми плакали отут?
There is a small diamond of land hanging off the north coast of the Black Sea, barely the size of a modest country, and for nearly 3,000 years, almost everyone who has ever built an empire has wanted to own it. The Greeks came for it, and built white marble cities on its shores. The Romans came, and the armies of Rome held its harbors. The Byzantines held it. And the Genoese merchants of medieval Italy built black fortresses along its cliffs. The Mongols swept in on horseback and made it part of the largest land empire in history. A great Khanate ruled it for 300 years. Then the Russian Empire took it, and the Soviet Union held it, and Ukraine inherited it, and Russia seized it again. Over and over for 3,000 years, the same small peninsula has been conquered, colonized, renamed, and fought over by empire after empire after empire. Why? Why would this one modest patch of land, mountains in the south, dry steppe in the north, hanging into a single sea, be worth so much blood for so long to so many? Because of where it sits. This peninsula juts down into the middle of the Black Sea like a fist, and whoever holds it holds command of that entire sea, its trade routes, its naval power, the soft underbelly of everything around it. It is one of the great strategic prizes of the world, a natural fortress and a natural harbor, set in exactly the wrong place to ever be left in peace. To hold it is to hold the Black Sea, and so the world has never stopped reaching for it. So here is one of the most beautiful places on the whole Black Sea, a sun-warmed land of palm-lined shores, vineyards, palaces, and mountains falling into a sparkling sea. A place that was, for 2 centuries, the beloved summer paradise of tsars and commissars alike. And here, in the same breath, is one of the most fought over, most contested, most tragic pieces of ground in Europe, a place whose beauty has never once bought it peace. Both of those things are true at the same time. Neither one is an exaggeration. The question this land forces on us is an old and painful one. What happens to a place and to a people when the land itself is simply too valuable, too perfectly placed, to ever be allowed to belong to itself? What does it mean to be the prize that everyone wants, and that no one in the end has ever been able to keep? This is Crimea. Everything about Crimea begins with the sea it hangs into, and the strange, doubled nature of the land itself. Look at it on a map, and Crimea is a rough diamond joined to the mainland of Ukraine by only the thinnest thread of land, a narrow isthmus just a few kilometers wide. In almost every other direction, it is surrounded by water, the Black Sea to the west and south, and to the east, the west and south, and to the east, a smaller strait called Kerch Strait. That thin gate of water at the peninsula's eastern tip will matter enormously by the end of this story. But for now, simply see the shape of the place. An almost Iceland hung into the sea, Isline joined to the world by threads. And the land itself is 2 completely different worlds pressed together. The north and center of Crimea is flat, dry steppe, open grassland running to the horizon, the western edge of the vast plains that sweep all the way across Ukraine and into Central Asia. This was the land of horsemen and herders, of the nomads who thundered across the steppe for thousands of years. But then, along the southern coast, everything changes. A range of mountains rises suddenly out of the peninsula, and on their far side, sheltered from the cold northern winds, lies a narrow strip of coast that is almost Mediterranean, warm, mild green, where cypress and palm and vine grow, where the sea is a brilliant blue against pale cliffs. In the space of a few kilometers you pass from the dry Eurastes to something that feels like the Aladian Riviera. That astonishing contrast, the harsh open north and the soft golden south, the world of the horseman and the world of the vineyard, is the secret of Crimea, and part of why so many, for so long, have found it irresistible. The human story here is almost impossibly deep. Layer upon layer, empire upon empire, and to walk Crimea is to walk through all of them at once. Begin nearly 3,000 years ago when the plains of Crimea belonged to the Scythians, the legendary nomad horsemen of the ancient steppe, fierce and rich, who buried their kings with hoards of golden treasure so magnificent that it still fills museums today, worked with astonishing skill into images of stags and lions and galloping horses. They left no cities, only their great burial mounds rising from the steppe and the gold sleeping within them. Then, along those southern shores came the ancient Greeks, sailing across the Black Sea to plant colonies, trading cities of white stone and temples and theatres, growing wealthy on grain and fish, and the trade with the wild interior. To the Greeks, this was the very edge of the known world, the shore, at the rim of their myths. This was the land where they set the legend of Iphigenia among the fierce Taurians, the people who gave the peninsula one of its oldest names. Their ruins still stand along the coast, marble columns and the foundations of forgotten cities against the blue sea. After them came the power of Rome, whose legions garrisoned these harbours at the empire's far frontier, and then, for many long centuries, the Byzantine Empire, the Christian Greek Empire we stood in when we visited Constantinople, which held the coast and spread its faith, leaving behind cave churches and whole monasteries carved into the soft rock of the cliffs, and the extraordinary cave cities of the interior looked entire settlements hollowed out of the tops of sheer plateaus where people lived and worshipped in rooms cut from the living stone. Then, in the Middle Ages, came new waves. Merchants from Genoa, in Italy, built mighty fortresses along the Crimean coast, running a trade network that reached across the whole Black Sea and all the way to the markets of Aea. Their great walls and towers still rise above the harbour at Sudak, one of the most spectacular medieval fortresses anywhere on the sea, golden stone against the water. This was a cosmopolitan, trading world, where Italians and Greeks and Armenians and Jews and Turks all met and did business on the same shores. And down from the north came the Mongols, the horsemen of Genghis Khan's descendants, sweeping the steppe into the enormous empire known as the Golden Horde. And out of that Mongol world was born the power that would give Crimea its most distinctive identity of all, the Crimean Khanate, and the people we now call the Crimean Tatars. The Crimean Tatars are the story at the heart of this land, the people who, more than any other, can call this peninsula their own, and whose fate is the most haunting thread in the whole of Crimea's history. So hold on to them, because we will return to them, and their story is the one that will stay with you. They emerged from the mingling of the Golden Horde's Mongol and Turkic horsemen with the many older peoples of the peninsula, and by the 15th century they had built the Crimean Khanate, a Muslim state that ruled Crimea and the surrounding steppe for some 300 years. Their capital was the beautiful town of Bakhchisarai, the Palace of Gardens, where the Khans built an exquisite palace of fountains, courtyards and mosques, a jewel of Islamic architecture that still stands today, with its famous Fountain of Tears that a great poet once made immortal in verse. For centuries this was a powerful and often formidable state, closely tied to the Ottoman Empire in Istanbul, its horsemen ranging far across the steppe. And the Crimean Tatars developed a rich culture, all their own, their language, a Turkic tongue of its own character, their music and their haunting songs, their crafts of metalwork and embroidery and leather, their distinctive cuisine, their Islam, gentle and deep-rooted, woven into the rhythm of village life. This was their homeland. Not a colony, not a conquest, home for hundreds of years, the place where their language was born and their dead were buried and their whole world was made. And then, in 1783, the empire to the north swallowed them. Catherine the Great of Russia annexed the Crimean Khanate, ending 3 centuries of Tatar rule and beginning something new, the age of Russian Crimea. Many Tatars left in the years that followed, emigrating to the Ottoman lands rather than live under the new rulers, the first thinning of a people from their own soil. And for those who stayed, it was the beginning of a long tragedy that would reach its darkest point in the century to come. Because once Russia took Crimea, it fell in love with it, and remade it in its own image. The Russian Empire and later the Soviet Union poured themselves into this peninsula. That warm southern coast, so mild and beautiful, became the summer playground of the Russian soul. The tsars built dazzling palaces along the shore, none more famous than the White Palace at Riviera, near Yalta, the seaside residence of the last Tsar and his family. The Russian aristocracy built villas and vineyards. Crimean wine and Crimean champagne became famous across the empire. Writers and painters came for the light and the sea. The great playwright Anton Chekhov built a house at Yalta and wrote some of his finest work looking out over these waters. And later, under the Soviet Union, that same coast became the reward of the whole nation. Rows of sanatoriums and holiday resorts where millions of ordinary Soviet workers came year after year to take the sun and the sea air. For generations of Russians and Soviets, Crimea was not a foreign place at all. It was the beloved South, the sunshine, the holiday, the sea, woven deep into the culture, the songs, the memories of an entire people. Remember that, because it is one of the keys to everything that has happened since. To millions, Crimea does not feel like a possession. It feels like home, or at least like the memory of the happiest days of their lives. And this coast was written into history in another way, too. At Riviera Palace, in the last winter of the Second World War, the leaders of the Allied powers, Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin, met at the famous Yalta Conference to shape the entire post-war world, top drawings that would divide Europe for the next half-century. And the very name of one Crimean city became, in English, a byword for suffering and futile courage. Sevastopol and Balaclava, where in the Crimean War of the 1850s, the great powers of Europe fought a long and terrible campaign, and where the doomed charge of the Light Brigade rode into legend. Even the woolen hood we call a balaclava is named for a Crimean battlefield. This small peninsula has been soaked in the blood of great power wars again and again and again. But beneath the palaces and the battlefields, the deepest wound in Crimea's modern history was inflicted on its oldest people. And this is the part of the story that must never be left out. In 1944, in the final years of the Second World War, the Soviet dictator Stalin accused the entire Crimean Tatar people, the whole nation, every man, woman and child, of collaboration with the enemy. It was a collective punishment of monstrous cruelty. In a matter of days, in May 1944, virtually the entire Crimean Tatar population, around 200,000 people, was rounded up at gunpoint, packed into railway cattle cars, and deported en masse thousands of kilometers to the east, to the deserts and camps of Central Asia. They were given almost nothing, and many did not survive the journey or the terrible first years of exile. By some estimates, nearly half of the entire people died of hunger, thirst and disease. An entire nation, torn from the homeland it had lived in for 500 years in the space of a few days. Their villages were emptied, their mosques closed, their names erased from the map. For decades, they were forbidden even to return. It was one of the great crimes of the 20th century, and it very nearly succeeded in erasing the native people of Crimea from Crimea altogether. Only decades later, as the Soviet Union weakened and finally fell, were the Crimean Tatars at last allowed to come home, and tens of thousands did, streaming back to a peninsula that had been resettled by others in their absence, to rebuild their lives and their language and their faith almost from nothing. Their return, against all odds, is one of the quiet epics of modern history, a people who refused to disappear, who carried their homeland in their hearts across half a century of exile, and who came back to the mountains and the sea that were theirs. and their fate, as we will see, once again uncertain today. Step away from the cities and the palaces for a moment, out to the wilder edges of the peninsula, because Crimea is not only a stage for human history, it is a place of real natural beauty and fruchtbringing life. The Crimean mountains along the south are green and forested, cut with gorges and waterfalls, their high plateaus, called Yayla, sweeping and windswept, grazed by horses and sheep, wild with herbs and flowers in the spring. There are places up there where the wind has carved the rock into strange forests of stone, and deep cast caves riddle the limestone beneath, hung with pale curtains of crystal. In these forests still live red deer and roe deer and wild boar. Foxes and badgers move through the woods, and the rare Crimean subspecies of red deer picks its way along the wooded slopes. Along the dramatic coastline, cliffs and sea caves shelter colonies of seabirds, dolphins turn in the bays, and the famous Swallow's Nest, a tiny romantic castle perched impossibly on the very edge of a sheer cliff above the sea, has become the single most photographed image of the whole peninsula, a fairy tale silhouette against the blue. And there are stranger wonders too. In the west of the peninsula lie salt lakes that turn a vivid pink in the summer heat, their waters colored rose and crimson by the tiny life within them, their shores crusted white with salt, otherworldly lagoons glowing against the pale sky. There is the Great Grand Canyon of Crimea, a deep forested gorge cut into the mountains. There are lavender fields that run purple to the horizon in the summer, and pine forests that scent the warm air, and secret coves reachable only from the water. For all its terrible history, the peninsula is, simply, a place of great and varied beauty, which is, of course, exactly the problem. It is too lovely and too well placed to be left in peace. But Crimea's greatest natural role is one you cannot see in a single glance, because it happens in the sky. The peninsula sits directly beneath one of the great bird migration routes of the world, the highway between the breeding grounds of northern Europe and Asia, and the wintering grounds of Africa and the Middle East. Twice a year, vast numbers of migrating birds funnel over and around Crimea and its wetlands. Cranes, raptors, storks, waterfowl in their multitudes, pausing to rest and feed on the marshes and lagoons of the peninsula's edges before continuing their enormous journeys. The salt lagoons and shallow bays of Crimea are a vital way station on that global highway. For all that the peninsula has been fought over by men, it remains, twice a year, a place of passage and rest for millions of creatures who cross it without any thought of borders at all, following a map far older than Seni Empire, one written in the stars and the seasons, which brings us, at last, to Crimea today, and to the return, in our own time, of the oldest pattern in this land's long history. The peninsula, once again, as the prize in a great and bitter war. For most of the 20th century, Crimea was part of the Soviet Union, and in 1954 it was formally transferred, within that union, from Russia to Ukraine, a move that meant little at the time, when both were part of the same state. But when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Crimea became part of newly independent Ukraine, even as it remained home to Russia's Black Sea Naval Fleet, and to a population that was, by then, majority ethnic Russian, alongside Ukrainians and the returning Crimean Tatars. That unstable inheritance held, uneasily, for 2 decades. Then, in 2014, it broke, in the chaos following a revolution in Ukraine, and forces moved into Crimea and Russia annexed the peninsula, a move that Ukraine and most of the world declared illegal and never recognized. For the Crimean Tatars, who largely opposed the annexation, it brought a new wave of pressure, arrests, and fear, falling once again on the peninsula's native people. And then, after Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Crimea was transformed once more, this time into a vast military base, the launchpad and supply hub for the Russian war in the south, and in turn into a target. As this film is made, the beautiful peninsula is caught in the middle of that war. The long bridge across the Kerch Strait, built by Russia to bind Crimea to itself and opened with great fanfare, has been struck and damaged. Ukrainian drones and missiles reach deep into the peninsula, hitting fuel depots, bridges, railways, and military sites. There have been fuel shortages, blackouts sweeping across whole regions, and a tourist season, that old Crimean lifeblood, collapsing under the strain as the sunlit holiday coast becomes a place people are warned away from. And once again, reports describe the Crimean Tatars under particular suspicion and pressure, their activists imprisoned, their community watched, the peninsula's oldest people caught yet again between forces far larger than themselves. It would be wrong, and it would dishonor the place, to pretend to you that there is a simple or settled ending here. There is a war on, its course uncertain, and the future of Crimea, who will hold it, and what will become of the many peoples who call it home, is being decided, right now, in the oldest way this land has ever known, by force, over the prize that everyone wants. So stand at last on the cliffs of the southern coast at the end of the day, where the Crimean mountains fall into the Black Sea, and look out over the water. The Swallow's Nest Castle is a small dark shape on its rock below you, the same silhouette that has watched this sea for a century. The white palaces are catching the last of the light along the shore. Behind you, the mountains climb into forest and then into the windswept high plateau, where horses graze as they have for 3,000 years. Out on the water, the Black Sea is turning from blue to gold to grey, the same sea the Greeks sailed, and the Genoese, and the Ottomans, and the tsars, and the Soviet holidaymakers, and now the warships, and somewhere overhead, if it is spring or autumn, the birds are crossing, the cranes and the storks, pouring south over the contested peninsula toward Africa, following their ancient road indifferent to whose flag flies below. None of it is decided. The war may end in one settlement or another. The peninsula may change hands again, as it has so many times before, or it may not. What is certain is only what has always been certain here, that this small, beautiful diamond of land, hung in its sea, is too valuable and too perfectly placed ever to be left alone, and that its beauty, 3,000 years of it, has never once been enough to buy it peace. But this too is true, and it is worth holding on to. Beneath every empire that has come and gone, the land itself endures. The vineyards still ripen on the warm southern slopes. The fountain still weeps in the palace of the Khans at Baghchi-Sarai. The sea still breaks on the same pale cliffs the Greeks first saw. The Crimean Tatars, who have survived conquest and deportation and exile and return, are still here, still holding on to the homeland they have never stopped calling their own. And twice a year, the birds still cross, in their countless thousands, over the prize that everyone wanted, reminding anyone who watches that the land was here long before the empires, and will be here long after them. Take a breath. Stay a while. The sea will break on the cliffs of Crimea whether the flag above them is one color or another. This has been Where on Earth. Thank you for watching, and until the next journey.